Hi, welcome to the second episode of This Is Who We Are. My name is Steve Greenfield. I'd like to thank you for listening, and if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the Facebook page, share it with your friends, start talking about it. This is only the second program. For those of you returning, for those of you who are just joining us this week, I'm going to start out describing how I came up with the name of this show and what it is that I expect makes it very distinct from other commentary that you find online and certainly in the mainstream media. As I was just about wrapped up with the content for what was going to be episode one, we all unfortunately bore witness to the horrifying events in Washington on January 6th as a large group of violent insurrectionists stormed the United States Capitol with the intention of interrupting the legislative session that was going to confirm Joe Biden as President of the United States. By the accounts of many of the participants, they were also hoping to spark a wider violent insurrection throughout the United States. And during the midst of it, while it was actually unfolding, as it was only happening for a couple of hours and everyone was still inside the Capitol building, Joe Biden, many other leaders in Congress and in state houses throughout the United States took to the airwaves and astonishingly, I suppose many of them felt it would provide comfort. Others perhaps genuinely believe it because they must in order to be able to operate as they do in the positions that they hold. But the message that they came to us with is, this isn't who we are. And I just sat there shaking my head because this is unquestionably who we are. It's who we've always been. It's the legend of how this nation was born. It's the continuum from then, one insurrection after another, one battle after another, one violent struggle after another, generation after generation, for over 200 years. Again, from the founding of this country, the myth of the individual armed American, individual armed white Christian American, to be specific, forming into small bands and achieving freedom against overwhelming odds, against overwhelming force and power. And so that's the first thing. Of course, we've seen this many, many times. We learn it in our public school history. I don't know what the process is by which we edit it and then gradually forget it and try to sort of reimagine. Maybe it's Tom Brokaw telling us about the greatest generation over and over and over again, this brief window when everyone came together in let's remember, a segregated military. So a new mythology was created, but it was about a very short-lived and very specific period. And the rest of our country's history has been overwhelmingly one of the way the Constitution was actually written. One of two different countries with two different sets of values, two different types of economies, two different sets of organizing principles of how to govern, very awkwardly and uncomfortably grafted around a free trade and mutual defense pact. That is essentially, you can see it staring straight back at you when you read the text of the United States Constitution. There was no assurance that the South and the North were going to come together to actually be one country. If one system would be satisfactory to everyone that was considering whether or not to join. And so ultimately, the decision was made right there during the Constitutional Convention that we would not actually create democracy, one person, one vote democracy. We decided that we would have a system that would have only as much democracy as would prevent slavery from being ended by democratic processes. That was the requirement that was being issued by the slave-owning states in exchange for agreeing to join into this new federal system. And so we saw from the beginning the great compromise of the bicameral legislature, where one of the chambers was not going to be reflective of population and would have 2 seats per state no matter what. That chamber, interestingly, is the only part of the Constitution that cannot be changed by constitutional amendment, so we can't even democratically change that to this day. That two-seat favor extended out to two votes in the Electoral College that granted those smaller population states extra power in selecting the president. And in so having that extra power to select the president, along with that extra power in the Senate, which is the cabinet confirming and Supreme Court confirming body, we established right from Jump Street a system of minority rule that favored the slave states. As if that weren't enough, we added in the three-fifths compromise, commonly misconstrued as granting black Americans only three-fifths of a human being status, when that's not what it did. Black Americans had zero status. They were property. They had no status whatsoever. The three-fifths compromise was actually a way of granting 60% of their count as additional voting strength for their white property-owning masters in the states where slaves were held. And so doing, we actually built in a significant incentive for the slave states to hold ever more slaves, because the more slaves they had, the more voting strength this small number of slave-owning white people would be able to have. And so in the sense that the most important thing was not to have democracy, but to create a union, North and South agreed right from the beginning that we would not actually have democracy, but we would have only as much of it as we could have and preserve slavery indefinitely. And from there on, it was straight through to 1861, and of course, obviously, through 1865 and beyond. An endless procession of violence throughout the United States and the new territories it was acquiring, as well as endless political struggle, factional political struggle, to continue extending new slave territories so that the balance could never be upset and slavery could be assured going forward of never being ended by democratic means. And so when people say we're more polarized than ever, that's ridiculous. Don't think that. We were born polarized. We stayed polarized. We kept extending this balance. We drew a Mason-Dixon line. We created the Missouri Compromise. We ended that with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. It had an impact so far-reaching that one of our two major parties at that time dissolved. And civil war broke out in Kansas. And that continued and spread until finally the full nationwide civil war broke out in 1861. How anyone can look at the history of this country and just toss out a line like we're more polarized than ever, even to say we're more polarized than any time since the Civil War, is also fundamentally untrue. You know, it was in my own childhood when the civil rights legislation was passed, and once again, federal troops were all over the United States escorting children into school, using new federal civil rights legislation to bring justice to murderers, and to provide some justice for the victims of murder, where states were not pursuing criminal justice against people on the basis of race. Federal troops, federal prosecutors, federal investigations. To this day, after Ferguson, right, the Justice Department does a civil rights investigation of police departments, brings them under consent order. We've never lost that initial polarization. We've changed its name, from north to south to red to blue, but we still map it, right? Still have that map, red and blue, and we tend to judge that map as being somehow how we delineate our values as Americans. And so we're actually a lot less polarized right now, believe it or not. And think about that, like really dwell on that and think about that, make that meaningful in your mind, that we're actually considerably less polarized right now. There are no federal troops anywhere, throughout the country. Yeah, some National Guard were brought in too little too late at the Capitol building. But we don't currently have any states that are occupied by federal troops. And we're really actually in not one of the more dramatically polarized times of our history. And so, one of the things that I'm going to do for the first several episodes, because I really have something else that I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about how it doesn't have to be this way. I'm here to talk about how we can be a pluralist society, not a united society like the words that were used by our leaders, by Joe Biden in particular, but how we can be pluralistic and still find some common ground in the center of that Venn diagram where the United States as a country continues to progress, continues to solve its problems. And even, at this point, we've kind of lost our ability to recognize what our problems are. We now seem to think that our problems are all just how to fight with each other better and who's going to vanquish the other side, who's going to prevent the other side from being the side that's temporarily in the majority and governing the country or governing our states. Nobody really seems to be that concerned at the moment about whether or not any of our problems are solved. There are people who are willing to live with problems as long as the side they don't like isn't winning the next election. We've kind of, dumbed down the whole process where it's sort of like an electoral civil war. Okay, it just broke out into some violence. But for quite some time now, going back to the mid 1990s, we're basically involved in a seesawing electoral civil war where we only care about the side and not what's actually happening with legislation, with policy, what's going on. And we really need to move beyond that. And I honestly believe that we can, because the same dynamic that started this divide at the beginning still exists today. It's not the regular people that come up with this stuff on our own. We're directed by people of vast wealth, whose growth of their vast wealth and the preservation of their power over the rest of us is dependent on us feeling like we're allied with a side, when in fact the terms of how we understand that are being explained to us by people who sell those explanations for profit. What we've been told is the ethos of the blue-collar white man in this country right now, the conservative blue-collar white man. A guy named Rupert Murdoch dictates that. He's a billionaire. He's Australian. He's not even American. A billionaire Australian since the 1990s has been dictating the terms of what we all take to be the ethos of the blue-collar white male in this country. Obviously there's something wrong. How did we become convinced of that? We know that Rupert Murdoch owns that station. By the same token, Rachel Maddow somehow defines what constitutes what people think of as, the liberal ethos of the inclusive ethos, of the identity ethos, whatever those things are. Of opposition to all things blue-collar white male. Those things are dictated by other giant corporative executives and investors at MSNBC and at this point certainly CNN and other outlets. But I'll tell you something. Rachel Maddow gets paid $20 million a year. Sean Hannity also gets paid about $20 million a year. And neither one of them have lost a penny to the pandemic. Their employment is still open. I don't know about you, but I've been unemployed since March. I'm a musician. I make my living in nightclubs, in bars, in public parks when communities are holding outdoor community performances and things like that. And all of that's shut down. I've been unemployed since March. And yet, Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity are still getting paid $20 million. They can show up to work because their job, they are the essential workers to the people in power. Okay, the people that work in the supermarkets aren't the essential workers. The people that work on ambulances aren't the essential workers. I, as a volunteer firefighter, I am certainly not an essential worker. I have no idea when I'm going to become eligible for a vaccine. And I have to interact regularly with the public in the course of providing an essential emergency service. And yet I am not an essential worker. If I were an essential worker, I wouldn't have zero income since last March, would I? The essential workers are the Rachel Maddows, are the Sean Hannitys, They're still working every day. They're still getting $20 million a year to do it because they are needed by the billionaires that employ them to be effective communicators to us of what we're supposed to think of who we are, who it is we think of as our friends and our allies, and most importantly, who we think of as our enemies. Because if we have an enemy to attack, we'll sacrifice anything, right? We'll use rationing books and garden our own vegetables if it'll help win World War II. And likewise, we'll go without health care if that'll help us beat Trump. We'll vote for someone who's not providing health insurance if that'll help us beat Trump. If you're looking at it from the other direction, we'll go without health care if that'll help us beat Biden. We'll go without being able to afford higher education for our children, which they need if they're going to work because we're no longer a manufacturing and mining economy for decades already. But I'll forego that and not have any idea if my children are ever going to be able to find a job and be out of poverty if we can beat the Democrats. So that's why Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity are still getting $20 million a year from the billionaires. And I don't just mean the people that own their networks. I mean the consumer products corporations that supply the money for all that, right? You've got their loyal audiences, and they're selling their products to those eyeballs. Those eyeballs remain transfixed. And so as long as we have those dread enemies, and those dread enemies are internal, there is no sacrifice we will not make. And so what ends up happening is that year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation, we've lost sight of the fact that the sacrifice never ends. We never get the health care. We never get the college education. We never get the wage increases. The people who lost their work as jobs were exported were never retrained. They never found jobs. They've been sitting around idle, watching television, either Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity, and getting angrier and angrier and angrier with neither Sean Hannity nor Rachel Maddow doing anything about the conditions that made them so angry and gave them so much time to sit around watching TV in the first place. I am not pessimistic that we can't move beyond that. We just have to recognize why it exists, and that the reasons it exists today is the same reason that it was created back in the 1700s. It's about preserving power, about increasing revenue streams to the people in power. I'll just take a quick pause now. We're a little past the quarter point in this broadcast, and so I'll remind you, if you came in late, this is a new public affairs commentary program. It's called This Is Who We Are. My name is Steve Greenfield, and I will be your host. And so we'll continue now into the second quarter and go through a little bit of history. I'm going to pick out like one or two every week, and then bring it into today from there, so that you'll understand what this is about how this really is who we are. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is something we actually did learn about. You'll remember it because you'll remember the name John Brown, right? John Brown's Rebellion, the raid on Harper's Ferry. Right? You might remember this glorious painting of John Brown with his flowing beard holding out a gun. That was actually depicting him not at Harper's Ferry. That was depicting him in Kansas, because before Harper's Ferry, when he finally got stopped, he was rebelling against slavery in Kansas, in the Kansas Territory, in the immediate aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This country, boy, you think we're in chaos now. Boy, did we launch into chaos in 1854. Trying to replace the Missouri Compromise with the Kansas-Nebraska Act to try to create a sovereignty rather than a borderline under which new territories could decide for themselves whether they wanted to be free state or slave, was so profound in its impact and so violent in its reaction that civil war broke out in Kansas. You can Google this. It's called Bleeding Kansas. It's called the Kansas Civil War. Pro-slavery people from Missouri crossed the border to try to pretend that they were voters in Kansas so that Kansas would vote to be a slave state. Shooting was breaking out from both sides. John Brown was one of the leaders of the of the guerrilla bands that were fighting against the Missourians and other people. Of course, it's important to remember that not all of the opposition to slavery was purely ideologically based. A lot of the anti-slavery people at that time were people who just were not rich enough to own slaves. And they were trying to protect their own economic development because they knew that wealthier landowners who owned slaves would be able to buy much larger tracts of land, wouldn't have to pay for labor, and they would never be able to become economically successful themselves. So not everybody was in this for altruistic reasons, but that's actually a valuable thing to remember, which we're going to come back to later when I start talking about today, about how to form unusual alliances. Because there was an unusual alliance, right? Violent people who were interested in freeing the slaves joined together with other violent people who couldn't care less about the freedom of black people and were only thinking about their own wallets. But they understood that the great landowners and the great slave holders were their enemies. And today, we don't really understand that anymore, right? We don't understand that the executives of our giant corporations and the investors, the great investors and the billionaires and the Jeff Bezoses and the Bill Gateses of America, yes, even the George Soroses of America, are not our friends, right? And we could form these unusual alliances. It's really the basis of this program, is the need to do that and how we go about doing it, and reminding you of the history of how we used to do it, right? So here's a perfect example of that. The anti-slavery forces were made of two distinct groups. One purely anti-slavery on moral grounds, and the other just looking out for their own interests. They joined together. On the other side of that coin, the pro-slavery people and the anti-slavery people were also able to join together in between fighting each other for the common purpose of killing all the Native Americans. Because let's never forget, without killing all the Native Americans, there couldn't be a Kansas and Nebraska territory. There couldn't be a Missouri territory. There couldn't have been any of this westward expansion. Everybody was able to get together, just as we do now about invading Iraq and invading Afghanistan and invading Libya and invading Yemen and invading Venezuela and invading Syria. We drop all of our inability to work with each other and treating each other as enemies anytime we want to invade a country and take their oil. By the same token, we were all able to drop our antagonism towards each other, to kill the Native Americans, to kill the Mexicans, and take the Southwest, interestingly enough, where all of our oil would ultimately be discovered. Ironically, although they didn't know that at the time. But it was all for economic gain, right? It was all for land ownership and developing land for productive purposes. And so that's what was happening at that time. And so this violence persisted in Kansas for 5 years, man, 1854 to 1859. At the same time, what was happening in Washington? That's what caused one of our two major parties to break up. There was a split over slavery in the Whigs. The Democrats were firmly pro-slavery, except a couple of small groups in the North. The Whigs, they were kind of the moderates of the day, right? They were the lesser evil. They were the people who thought they could finesse this and keep getting one more compromise after one more compromise and keep dragging out this 1789 problem forever, and keep slavery from ever being, democratically ended. Well, what happened in the face of all this violence, tying it to where we are today, is that the Whig Party dissolved. Half of them joined the new party, the anti-slavery party, the Republicans. Half of them joined the Democrats. Not exactly half, because a few people here and there tried to form a couple of smaller parties, since nobody really knew what was going to happen in the aftermath of a major party dissolving. There was a lot of factionalization. But essentially what happened, and I want to especially caution any liberal listeners right now, progressive listeners, leftist listeners, however you identify yourself along that spectrum, a lot of people sort of rubbing their hands in glee today that if Donald Trump were to actually produce this Patriot Party that he's talking about, and apparently has already been incorporated in Texas as we speak, that this would mean, the end of the viability of the Republican Party, because its voters would be split between these two groups. The last time this happened in the United States, 2.5% of the population was dead, and they didn't have AR-15s back then. The firepower was a lot lower. The idea that our country will have one centrist corporate party that's substantially holding its coalition together, and the other major party is splintering. No, no, that's not a healthy prescription. We certainly want the other major party to be restored to sanity to some degree, but the ultimate breakdown of the institution leaves a power vacuum, and power vacuums in this country, like in so many other countries, are settled by violence. There's no way to vote your way out of a power vacuum. There's no constitutional provision for that. So I personally do not relish the idea of the dissolution of the Republican Party. Again, informed by history, informed by current events here, informed by events in other countries that have experienced these kind of power vacuums. It's not good. We're already bankrupt, the federal treasury. We have a pandemic. We're overextended in military operations around the world. We're at each other's throats. We're in much too great of a crisis right now for anybody to be thinking that the dissolution of one of our mere two balanced electoral institutions is a favorable development in this country. So let's wipe that out of our consciousness right away. Okay, towards the end of this conflict, the side of good that we might think, right? The side of good, the side that's trying to end slavery. John Brown, charismatic leader, probably not sane as we think of that today. Someone who's inspirational by the force of his character, who's able to inspire people to martyr themselves, literally martyr themselves for his cause, as he was willing to martyr himself. Gets himself to Virginia, a place called Harper's Ferry, now in West Virginia, because that state split during the Civil War, but it was all Virginia at the time. And his plan was to raid the arsenal there that supplied the local divisions of the militia and arm slaves. He thought that the success of this operation would incite a massive slave rebellion and basically create a full-blown civil war in the United States, not the type that then happened in 1861 as a result of secession and a structural civil war, but more of a chaotic internal civil war, maybe more like the French Revolution or something like that, and would end slavery through violent revolution. And he, of course, faced, as so many small guerrilla groups do today, the reality of the overwhelming power of an organized military. The state militias that were backed up by the United States Marines quickly ended his rebellion. He also, as so many insurrectionists do, overestimated the prospect of the slaves joining the rebellion, the prospect of abolitionists from the North sweeping down to join and take up these arms to assist the slaves and free them. That did not materialize. He was arrested, tried, convicted. He admitted what he did. He was charged with the same exact things that many of us are believing that Trump and Giuliani and people involved in the Capitol insurrection should be charged with now, right? Inciting insurrection, treason, murder, same exact charges. Those were the things that John Brown was charged with. And because he was interested in the process growing and becoming a martyr for this cause that he was always ready to die for, he admitted to what he'd done. He was hanged, and he did develop martyr status in the abolition movement. So that actually came to pass. So that's Bleeding Kansas. It's really, if you look at it from the breakdown of the political system that happened in 1854 and the war that broke out in Kansas at the time, and people crossing borders, the election fraud, the bloodshed, the crossing of state lines all the way to Virginia to raid an arsenal and begin an insurrection in the United States. The Civil War didn't begin in April of 1861. The Civil War began in 1854 in the aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Just started small. John Brown didn't get the spread he wanted in 1859, but certainly 2 years later that date arrived, and the full-blown Civil War was out. So there's a case of armed insurrection that was being waged, on moral grounds, on economic grounds. And some would argue that by the time 2.5% of the American population was dead by April of 1865, that it achieved its goal. The Three-Fifths Compromise was ended. Slavery was ended. Reconstruction was begun. There was this brief period that lasted for only 11 years where something resembling an actual unified country was being attempted to be formed until that all broke down. Okay, so we're going to we're about the next quarter right now, and so I'm going to remind people, in case you came in late, again, you're listening to the second episode of This Is Who We Are. My name is Steve Greenfield. I'm your host. I assure you that this program is going to be unlike any other that you might be enjoying online, certainly not available to you in the mainstream media. And so we will continue from there to another insurrection that happened, an actual successful insurrection of enormous significance in this country's history, changed the course of history in this country, not just in the locality where it happened. I don't know why this is not part of the standard American history curriculum. It certainly should be, and I would advocate that we all talk to our local school boards and superintendents about getting it included. The 1898 municipal election of the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, was overthrown. We had a local coup d'etat in this country. 2,000 armed white men just a couple of days after the election of 1898, who had been campaigning aggressively on a literally, expressly, explicitly white supremacist, their term, white supremacist platform, trying to end the post-Civil War pluralistic government of black Republicans and some white economic populists that had formed a fusion alliance that had been successfully governing that section of North Carolina since the end of the Civil War. And when the election went to the fusionist parties, the people that had been campaigning on the white supremacist party violently overthrew them. 2,000 armed people. They killed as many as 300 black people over the course of a few days, burned homes, evicted and exiled, literally exiled at least 2,000 more, forced the government out, took over the government of Wilmington, North Carolina, themselves installed themselves. They were recognized by the state legislature, obviously by the white racist state government of North Carolina. It was something that was not in federal jurisdiction, so there was nothing that Washington tried to do to restore the results of the election in this city. Not only were no criminal charges ever brought, not only was the state of North Carolina never interested in upholding the results of that particular election, but quite the contrary, all of the leaders of this overthrow, of this coup, who then became the government of Wilmington, North Carolina, went on to become more than one of them governors of North Carolina, senators from North Carolina, congressmen from North Carolina. It was very brief, but I believe the first female senator, at the very least, definitely the first female senator from North Carolina, even though it was only a fleeting moment, was one of the leaders of this white supremacist armed insurrection and pogrom and mass murder and exile that overturned an election in this country. And they became cabinet members in the United States government, judges. Every one of them went on to very great success. And so that then launched the era of ending black voting rights. Most of the horror of what we call Jim Crow, the onset of the erection of the Confederate monuments, the full segregation package, the conversion, the use of the kind of the escape clause in the 13th Amendment that compulsory labor could only be possible in the event of being convicted of a felony. And so these white governments then launched into something that we would today call quality of life crimes, the criminalization of poverty, so that they could then force compulsory labor, chain gangs, force black people into prisons, again, directly enslave them for production for the state, rent them out, contract out their labor to private companies, to generate revenue for the state. There's another lingering thing from the Civil War, right? That section of the 13th Amendment, boy, that has to be changed. We still have slaves in this country today, and the slaves that we have in this country today are disproportionately black, because our criminal codes criminalize so many elements of lifestyle and poverty. And the way that our wealth is distributed in this country is so much a function of race, that we still actually have slavery in this country, as a result of that clause of the 13th Amendment. So that was the overthrow of Wilmington, North Carolina, the coup, the massacre of North Carolina. Boy, talk about polarization. Talk about how this is who we are. Boy, the people that were up in the Capitol, you can be sure that most of them were, expecting that something like this was what was going to happen. Their expectation was certainly in keeping with what John Brown was expecting when he raided Harper's Ferry to capture the arsenal there. We can be sure that their actions were informed by this long, uninterrupted history. And so I'm going to reiterate that again before I now turn it around to the point where we're going to start talking about what's happening today and how anybody who's really genuinely interested in it can just say, we're not going to show up for this anymore. We're not going to show up for being on either Sean Hannity's team or Rachel Maddow's team, and specifically enriching them and the owners of their corporations and the two political party structures that speak through those media institutions, while none of our personal problems ever get better, while my children never have any improved hope of going to college or getting health care. That we're just not going to show up for this war anymore, and that we're going to dedicate ourselves not to the idea of unity, because to achieve unity literally means that one faction has to completely crush the other, which, aside from the fact that it's impossible, do we really want that to happen? There are cultural elements in a diverse society that are sort of related to people's histories and cultures and religions and ancestry, geography, really, even geography, right? People who live near the water do a lot of fishing and a lot of swimming and maybe a lot of surfing, right? And people who live in the mountains, they do a lot of hunting, and people who live in valleys do a lot of farming. Boy, there's so much that's involved in a beautiful, multicultural, society, thriving civilization, that the idea of achieving some kind of unity through a factional conquest of some kind. I mean, even if it were possible, which it's not, so get the idea out of your head, because it's not possible. But even if it were, it is something that we don't really seek, because the loss to the overall culture and the way that we feed back to each other would be lost forever. And if we think about that honestly, that's not something we really want. We want our differences to be able to continue. We just don't want there to be any inherent oppression in it. And we can have this, right? We can have this cake and eat it too. We can have our cultural diversity, and we can have it free of oppression. We can have it with full democracy and free of oppression. That would be so much better for everybody. There would be no erasure, the thing that people are taught to fear, that my culture is going to disappear. No. We can have it all. All that would disappear is some of the profit going to the people that communicate to us and recruit us into these factions at the expense of having our problems in our real world lives ever, I don't even want to say ever properly addressed, let alone fully addressed. They're just not addressed at all. So what about these supposed, differences that we have, that we've chosen that we want to live in encampments and never interact with people in politics in the way that we participate in being a self-governing people? Because, right, the word politics gets a really bad name, but in reality, what we're attempting to do, what we call politics, is our attempt as citizens to be self-governing, right? We have a Republican form. We elect people, and they specialize in administering public affairs, right? And so, we've learned to dismiss that as politics. It's a dirty word, but it shouldn't be a dirty word, because there's no important function in a democracy than citizen, right? That's the most important person in a democracy, is citizen. And surely we're aware that as citizens, we don't all agree on things. So gradually we fall into these traps of factionalizing and saying that there's absolutely nothing that we can do, that we're interested in doing, working with people, because they're just such horrible people. They have so much guilt on their hands, so much blood, so much oppression. Their attitude is so bad. What they'd like to see overall for the United States is such a bad thing that we must never attempt to reach out to them and work on anything. And that's when the Rupert Murdochs of the world, that's when they've got us. Okay, when they've got us to that point, that's when they've actually got us. Now, obviously, none of this was insurmountable in the past. Right? We have fire departments. They're operated publicly. Through the 1860s, they were private and paid for by insurance companies. We have 911, we have roads, we have bridges, we have schools. Do you know any right-wing people running for office saying that they're going to privatize fire departments? It's unimaginable. And this is a left-wing thing. This is a fully socialist operation. Is anybody in these deep red states, in these states that you consider rife with fascists, Oklahoma, Texas, is anyone running for office in Texas saying that they're going to privatize the University of Texas, that they're going to privatize Texas A&M because they're socialist and shouldn't be public function? Of course not. Of course not. The Daytona racetrack in Daytona, Florida, was built by the city of Daytona, with public funds. NASCAR, man. The big game, Oklahoma versus Nebraska, Army, Navy. Boy, there's so much out there in which everybody just came to realize that function comes first. Who wants to do something more efficiently, than a capitalist, right? If something needs to be done and there's no efficient for-profit way to do it and no way to deliver it to a significant number of people, then you do it publicly, right? That used to be something that was universally understood. And there are still so many public functions in our lives that nobody, no matter how right-wing, no matter how fascist you might feel they are, is even dreaming of proposing. Sure, they'll talk about, grandma killing when it comes to healthcare, but that's only because healthcare doesn't exist. Those very same people who talk about that, they're also walking around at those same protests with signs that say, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." They will not give up their Medicare. Medicare has improved their lives so much, improved the lifespans and ended poverty for elderly people by so much for so long that, just like with the idea of privatizing fire departments or the University of Texas, nobody, no matter how right-wing, no matter how hardcore a Kansas Republican they are, they're not making that proposal. And so that gives you hope. That gives you hope right there. Those channels are still open. Just because Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity have closed them down doesn't mean they're closed. It just means that somebody has to do a show talking about them. That's me. Here we are. That's what this show is going to be. This show is going to be about how we don't have to show up for those factions. We can show up for ourselves and solve some of the problems. We're not going to get everything we want, but at least we'll get some of it like we used to. Back in the mid-1960s, the three principal civil rights bills, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, they had larger proportions of affirmative votes in Congress by Republicans than by Democrats, because it just wasn't divvied up that way back then. And yes, things have changed over the time. But if things have changed to make it more divvied up, then we can just not show up for that. And when we stop showing up for that, that becomes disempowered. And the process by which we can re-divvy it up again back the other way can begin. But first, you have to agree. Turn off all the influencers on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that you follow, stop retweeting, stop puffing up and empowering and furthering. They're getting money. When you retweet Rachel Maddow, she's getting $20 million and you're getting nothing. If you're a conservative, if you're retweeting Sean Hannity, he's getting $20 million and you're getting nothing. Why? Let him pay for his ratings. Let him pay for that reach. He's not sharing his wealth with you. You're unemployed from COVID and he's not, and you're still helping him, grow his paycheck. Let's just cut that out. Let's just cut that out right now and reestablish what we used to have. Let's not show up for their war, and they won't be able to have it anymore. So here we are, roughly about the 3/4 mark, and I'll pause again to remind you you're listening to the second episode of a new public affairs commentary program with a new approach. We're called This Is Who We Are. My name is Steve Greenfield. This is who we are. Just because this is who we are does not mean that it's who we have to remain, and it is certainly means by which we can move beyond this and do something else on our own behalf. So I'm going to talk for a minute to any listeners who might think of themselves as to the progressive and leftist side of the spectrum because of some current events that are happening right now that have me rather perturbed. I think we identify with each other. I don't use the lingo. As I mentioned in last week's episode, I don't want to use words like left and right, socialist, capitalist, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. Those labels are the boundaries that keep us from finding the things that we can achieve together. It makes us feel like we're part of a tribe. We stop analyzing issues and instead start analyzing who's talking about them. And then either buy in or shut down, depending on who it is that has taken the initiative. But if you look at the kind of policies I tend to support and my career, I help run a fire department. That's a public institution. I spent 2 terms on a school board. It's a public institution. I believe in full health care, insurance at the very least, the insurance system as a public institution. So, we have that shared purpose together, even though I'm not necessarily using your language. I'm finding myself, I should mention also, I'm a vice president of a labor union, a local labor union, the musicians union here in the Hudson Valley. So this week, there's suddenly been a huge groundswell of attack against some people who have been influential to niche markets, really, of progressive and left-wing people, Caitlin Johnstone and Jimmy Dore, for sort of raising their voices about progressive Democrats not using all the tools at their disposal to get their caucus in Congress to advance progressive goals, which we were certainly promised some of them would be advanced, right, on the blue no matter who, right? We've got to get rid of Trump, and then we'll be paying you back with some of your goals. And that's not happening. And so some of these people, Jimmy Dore, Caitlin in particular, have been expressly bringing themselves to audiences that up until now have generally been communicated to through right-wing communications networks. And this is causing outrage. No, you will not make common cause with fascists. We will not work with fascists. We will not collaborate with fascists. We will not. Okay, hold on a second. Are you really trying to get any of the things that you believe in accomplished? Or are you just trying to keep the boundaries from being broken down, lest you not have the small niche influence that you currently have when you say that? Are you just reinforcing who gets to sit at the lunch table? Are you trying to keep people from getting up from that lunch table? Let me ask you this. If Tucker Carlson's audience, in your mind, is made up of people you consider fascists and racists, why would you want Tucker Carlson to be the only person talking to them? Why? How is that in your interest? To have nothing going to them except what Tucker Carlson says, except what Sean Hannity says. Why would you want that? It doesn't make sense empirically. We were told over and over again that 800,000 Bernie Sanders 2016 primary voters crossed over and voted for Donald Trump. If the Democrats had not rigged their primary and allowed Bernie Sanders to win, those 800,000 people, you wouldn't be calling them fascists. You'd be calling them democratic socialists. They would have helped make Bernie Sanders president of the United States and supported all the legislation that he was promising to bring. Now they're Trumpies, because the establishment didn't let them have a voice. And of course, now Trump didn't let them have a voice either. What better time than right now, with Trump out of the way and with the insurrection failed and Trump looking like a lunatic, to go into those audiences and say, we were the people that weren't yanking your chain. We were the people that actually have drafted policy. We're the people that can make this happen. Are they going to join you on everything? No. But do they want health care for their children now that they're unemployed and can't get it from their employers anymore? Yeah, you know what? An awful lot of them do. Maybe not all of them, but just enough of them. If you add them to the Democrats that want it, it now becomes a majority and you get it passed. So it makes sense what they're doing. I've done it myself when I ran for Congress in 2018. And again, just now in 2020 on a third-party line, on the Green Party line. Of course, I didn't get a dramatic number of votes. The idea was not to win, but to put pressure inside the electoral process. And what ended up happening was in the counties in my district that are majority Republican, my proportion of votes were 2 to 6 times, not a little bit, 2 to 6 times better in the Republican counties than in the Democrat ones. My supposedly extreme left-wing socialist message resonated better among blue-collar white people. It's an overwhelmingly white district, completely white in the Republican portions. And yet, I did better getting votes in those demographics with my supposedly flaming left-wing socialist anti-American platform. And so I can also tell you from firsthand experience that when people are disaffected, they want to be treated with respect. They don't want to be told, lesser evil, hold your nose, we'll get to you next time. Next time never comes because the big ticket donors always get their investment returned to them with profit, and the rest of us end up getting bupkis. So when you see people going out to try to chart their way into new markets, they're probably not going to win Tucker Carlson's audience over in their entirety and have them become Jimmy Dore fans and have them become socialists. That's not going to happen. All you need them to do is come in on a couple of issues, whatever the couple of issues might be that resonate with them. They want wages, right? They want their crops not to fail. They want the wildfires to stop. They want infrastructure. They want jobs. They want health care. They don't want to lose their house if their child gets sick. There are places, there are points of access to these audiences, and the people that don't want this outreach to happen are the people at the DNC, at the RNC, at Fox, at MSNBC. These are the people that don't want it to happen, because what happens to them if we stop showing up? What happens to them when we say, your way hasn't been doing anything for our lives. We're walking away. I want to hear something different, And if somebody you think of as your side, okay, we don't have sides, right? We don't have, what we have, let's be honest, especially if you're a progressive or a leftist, you're aware of this, okay? We have owners of tremendous amounts of wealth, tremendous amounts of the means of production by which the rest of us are allowed to work. If we accept the terms of wages and conditions that they offer to us, they allow us to work, right? Basically, the relationship is we are, 310 million people who work for a living and about 10 million people who mostly make their living from the surpluses of the work that we do for them, right? So we have owners and we have workers. That's what we have. And it doesn't matter. Don't call them left-wing, right-wing. At some point, people are able to recognize that they're not one of the owners, that they're one of the workers, right? We build that common ground. And starting from that point of common ground, who knows where we could go? So when you see somebody doing something unorthodox, it's because orthodoxy hasn't been working. And so I ask those of you who identify as being on the left, What has this narrow band system that you work with, what has it accomplished? It doesn't even get you candidates in the mainstream Democratic Party. Okay? You keep voting for the corporatist candidates, hoping for a crumb. You're not even able to propel a significant candidate. And you end up with blue no matter who, time after time again. Your system does not work. Your system stopped working in 1968 when Gene McCarthy, the progressive, won the Democratic primary. The Democrats gave the nomination to Hubert Humphrey, who wasn't even running. The Chicago Democrat mayor cops were beating up protesters in the street on live television, and the Southern Democrats left the party with George Wallace to run independently and win 5 states, making Richard Nixon the president of the United States. That's when your system broke down, and it hasn't accomplished a single thing. It's gone backwards ever since. Bill Clinton did more right-wing things during his 8 years than Ronald Reagan did. He did more to harm labor. He did more to harm wages. He did more. What are you doing that's been working? How dare you become angry? How dare you raise a polemic against people who are just honestly saying this hasn't been working and we're going to start looking around for other people? You know, the people who watch Tucker Carlson, they know that what they did 4 years ago didn't work for them. They got caught up in the excitement of this thing just now, and now they know they were lied to. What better time are you going to get 90? Boy, wouldn't it be great if you got 10% of them? You know, how could that be wrong? How could that be a problem? How do you do it if you don't go out and try? And now to everybody, wherever you see yourself in the last 2 minutes we've got here. The worst thing that's happened because of this division, because of us going to 2 different places for our information, is that we talk about gossip. The political news that we talk about is gossip. Whatever's going on between Kellyanne Conway and her teenage daughter, that's the biggest headline in the country. It's gossip, right? The daughter called the cops on her mother and put it up on TikTok. The mother did. This is gossip. We're not here to get revenge against Kellyanne Conway and put her in jail. That's not a political accomplishment. What has happened while we're talking about Kellyanne Conway and her teenage daughter? How many of you know that the world's largest private owner of farmland in the entire world is Bill Gates? That's news. None of us know it. It's not in the news. None of us know it. It's not trending on Twitter. It's not trending on Instagram. Bill Gates, the computer guy, he's the world's largest owner of farmland. You don't know that. You should. You need to know that. You need to know that the reason our gas prices have been skyrocketing over the last month is because on December 15th, Saudi Arabia and Russia finally came to a price fixing agreement. And that, prices are going up. And then a few weeks later, Saudi Arabia announced they're cutting supply even more. We don't even have capitalism. You think we do, but we don't. The world oligarchs of our principal natural resources fix prices, and that's why they're going up. Capitalists believe in competition. It's not in the news. We need to stop gossiping. We're counting down to the end of our 58 minutes for this week. I promise you that we're going to be talking about more of this. We're going to pick up where we left off, and I'll see you next week.